This video is about choosing the best sources out of your results list when searching library databases. We're going to illustrate this using our friend Steve. Steve is in the middle of a research assignment and is having a hard time making decisions about which of the results he's getting will be most helpful for his paper. He knows which kinds of sources he needs to find and is confident that he's looking in the right place. However, when he searches, alongside the handful of resources that immediately stand out as relevant, he's seeing a lot of things that look only partly relevant. He can't figure out which of these to pick out of the list to take a closer look at. Before changing search terms or trying a different database, Steve should evaluate his list of results using the CRAP test. CRAP is an acronym developed by librarians to help students remember criteria for evaluating sources, and it stands for currency, relevance, authority, accuracy, and purpose. With currency, Steve needs to make sure that the information is recent enough to still be relevant to the points he is trying to make in his paper. How recent a source needs to be depends both on the subject and the sort of information Steve's looking for. For instance, if he needs public opinion statistics for a current events assignment, a report published 10 years ago probably will be too old since it no longer reflects public opinion. However, if his assignment is to compare the thinking of two classic philosophers, a background source summarizing those philosophers' viewpoints may still be very useful even if it's decades old. The facts about what Socrates taught haven't changed from 1970 until now. Generally speaking, sources in the sciences go out of date very quickly, often in as little as 5 years, where sources in the humanities like history or philosophy are often useful for several decades or more. Most databases have some sort of date slider to help limit results based on how old they are, so Steve can get rid of results that are too old to be useful. With relevance, Steve needs to decide not just whether a source covers the subject he's interested in, but also whether the kind of information it contains fits with the research question he's pursuing. This is often related to source type. For instance, if Steve needs a scholarly discussion of his topic, an article in a popular magazine like Time is not going to be helpful, even if it covers the exact same subject he's writing about. Articles in popular periodicals don't have the type of analysis and source documentation Steve would find in a scholarly journal article. Since many databases contain both scholarly and non-scholarly sources, if Steve wants scholarly articles, he should look for a limiter that allows him to focus in on those, weeding out things like reviews, news articles, or any other source type that might clutter up his results. These kinds of limiters can usually be found along the left side of a search. With authority, Steve needs to make sure that authors and organizations behind the sources he has found are qualified to write on his topic. This is especially true if Steve finds himself searching Google. He should look to find out who wrote the source, what sort of credentials or training that person has that would make him or her worth listening to, and what sort of organization is behind distributing the information. Journal articles and books often contain information about the authors, usually either at the very beginning or very end. If that information is not provided, Googling an author, journal, or publisher to find their website or Wikipedia article can be very helpful. When Steve is considering accuracy, he should consider things like whether the information in a source is consistent with other authoritative sources he's found, whether evidence and citations are given, and whether the source has gone through any sort of editing process. Most scholarly sources go through an editing process called peer review, where experts in a field review a source's information before it is published to ensure accuracy. Not all assignments require scholarly or peer-reviewed sources, but Steve should make sure that the level of accuracy in a source is appropriate for the subject he is writing about. For instance, news summaries or blog posts might be fine for less formal assignments like certain reflection or response papers. But for a more formal research paper, professors generally expect him to use scholarly articles and books. Finally, when considering the purpose of a source, Steve should be thinking about why the source was produced, as well as how objective it appears to be. Was it created to inform, to entertain, to persuade, to sell? Some articles, like reviews or editorials, are primarily meant to offer opinions, and any bias may be very easy to identify based on the opinion being offered or the individual giving it. Others, like government reports and scholarly research articles, are primarily written to inform, and any potential biases would be much harder to spot. Steve will have to make sure that the purpose and objectivity of a source is appropriate to the kind of assignment he's doing. He should look at things like abstracts for articles and introductions for books, which usually state the purpose of the article or the book right up front. Using this CRAP test, Steve can go through his list of results and decide which sources have the appropriate currency, relevance, authority, accuracy, and purpose to use in his assignment, and by doing this, he can ignore or come back to the rest of his results.